The star of today's video is this Bear Paw Quilt Block. This has been one of my most popular blog posts when it comes to quilt block tutorials, so I decided it was time to give him some airtime. We're going to walk through this on video, and I'm going to show you that it's not quite as complicated as it might look. It does have a lot more pieces going together than your average quilt block, but if I can do it, you can too. And the key is to just be really precise and patient with each step. So, ready to get started? Let's look at this block. Sometimes I see a block with all these pieces, and I don't know if you're like me, but I get a little bit overwhelmed. I'm like, oh, that's way too many pieces. Am I sure I can handle it? But I promise you, you can, because I can. So let's just break it down. It's basically 4 squares that are the same. They're just pivoted, that are connected by 4 strips and 1 thing in the center. So that makes it feel easier already, right? To just break it down even further, it's basically made up of 1 square here, and then 4 HSTs or half square triangles. That is what each of the 4 bear paw prints are made up of. So that feels a lot more doable. Like, okay, it's just squares and half square triangles. I can handle that. Then we just add some rectangles and that fussy cut center, and we are good to go. If each corner needs 4 half square triangles, that is where most of our time is going to be spent. We are going to need 16 of these. So there's a couple ways to do half square triangles. In my original post, I was doing 2 half square triangles at a time. So to get 16, we needed to cut 8 pieces of white, 8 pieces of black. That was a lot of precise square cutting, in my opinion. So I'm going to do it differently in this video. It's going to be faster, and we're going to get the same thing that we need in the end. We're going to cut 2 black and 2 white, or whatever color you're working with. And the way we sew these together, we are going to get 8 half square triangles. So that way, we only have to do this process twice and trim these, and it's going to be a bit faster, and it's going to be a lot less cutting. You can go to my blog and you can get this written directions that show you how to put it all together, how to cut it. And it's going to give you sizes for both 6 and 12-inch bear paw blocks. Make sure you go grab that. After our half square triangles, we're going to need 4 rectangles. We're going to need 4 of the small white corners. We're going to need 4 of these bigger squares, which is the center of the paw. And then you're going to want to use 1 accent piece for the center. I just love how it's kind of neutral, and then that center just pops. So I always like to put something special in the middle of my bear paws. And I like him to be fussy cut, so I'm going to show you really quickly how to take your fabric and put whatever icon you specifically want in that center. We're going to talk about that. Let's get started. The first thing we are going to do is we are going to make our half square triangles. If you have this tape, you can use it. If you don't, you're going to need either a pencil or a heat erasable pen. I'm a big fan of the Madam Sew. And if you are going to do the 8 at a time, you're going to put your fabrics right sides together. And let's pretend that we don't have the tape, although I will show you how to use that as well. You're going to draw a line corner to corner in both directions. And now we're just going to pin that in place. And I like to pin on both sides, but kind of at a little bit of an angle. We basically want to make sure these 2 squares are not going to shift when we sew them, but we also want to have enough room for our presser foot to go on either side, because we are going to be sewing a 1/4 inch to either side of both of these lines. So see how I have them at a little bit of an angle? It's not straight like this, because if it's like this, my presser foot's going to hit that bird or the ball, whatever kind of pins you're using. So putting it at more of an angle, I can leave it there while I do the sewing, and it's going to hold my fabric in place, and it's not going to interfere with my presser foot. We take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch on each side of both of these. So 1, 2, 3, 4 stitch lines, and then we will bring it back. So we have both things going on here. We have the lines drawn so that we can just use our 1/4 inch foot and sew to either side of that line to make our half square triangles. I already have the diagonal seam tape placed down on my sewing machine, so I'm going to show you how you could use this if you didn't already draw lines on here. So like say we had turned it this way, we can use these lines as guidelines. If you have never used this before, check the link below this video, and there will be a link to the video that shows you how to do this in great detail. It shows you how to line it up, how to make sure it's coming off straight, and that all of your seams are going to be accurate without having that line drawn. So if you want to sew 1/4 inch from the center of each of these, you would line up your fabric so that this corner is on this black line, and this one is on this black line, and you would make sure that it stays on that black line as you move forward, because the red line indicates where your stitching is going to be. This one leads to the needle. These two are 1/4 inch away. So that is how that will work. If you're doing a lot of diagonal stitching, I highly recommend you check out the video about how to do this. It will save you a lot of time. So now I'm going to sew down either side with a scant 1/4 inch seam and a 2.0 stitch length. Whenever I'm doing quilt blocks, I'm doing 1.8 to 2.0 stitch length, just so that it is nice and secure. Then you just turn it around and you do the same thing on the other side. Now you will notice as I am using my presser foot to follow this line, this point is also following this black line. So depending on whether you want to draw your lines or use this tape will depend on where you look. If you're using drawn lines, you're going to keep your eye focused up here where the presser foot is. If you're not going to draw lines and you just want to use the tape, then you're going to keep your eye down here as you sew to make sure everything stays straight. Now that we have all 4 of these stitch lines, we're going to go back to the cutting table. One thing I love about this map by Christopher Thompson for Riley Blake is that it is white on one side and black on the other. So if you're using a darker fabric, you want to use the other side, but look at how much easier it's going to be for you to see what I'm doing when we put this white on top of the black. Love it. Now, very often when you're drawing lines and stitching, you then come and you cut along those lines. Do not make that mistake when you are doing 8 half square triangles at the same time. Been there, cut that. The first cut we're going to make is we're going to do it parallel to the outside. So we are going to cut an X, and I'm going to draw it just so that you can see. And then we're going to cut that way all through the center. And just to make sure everything's straight, I like to line squares like this up along my grid marks and make sure that my cut is going along that grid mark as well. Okay, so that brings us to 4. Now we are going to cut along the original angled line. So basically we're going to cut in between these 2 stitch lines. And that gives us one of our 8. So we're going to cut all of these apart, and then we are going to press them open and trim them. If you're going to be doing quilt blocks that have as many pieces as this Bear Paw, or doing a lot of quilting in general, I would recommend that you get a quilter's clapper or a tailor's clapper. The difference being the length. Quilter's clapper is a little bit shorter, tailor's clapper is longer. You can also find quilter's clappers that are squares, so they're the shape of a quilt block, but this is what I have for now. And it is an unfinished piece of wood with this nice grip. So what we're going to do is we're going to set these seams, we're going to press that down, and the wood is going to absorb some of the heat and any moisture that might be in there to make them lay flatter. And as I said at the beginning, being as precise as possible with each piece of this block is going to give you your best end result. So I've flipped these all so that the dark fabric is on top because of the way we are going to press them. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set that seam, which basically means I'm not going to open it up. I'm going to put a little heat on there. I'm going to press down with my quilter's clapper. And that just makes sure that those stitches get as flat as they can be before we fold this up. Then I'm going to push it this way because I want the dark fabric folding over the seam on the back, because then you're not going to see it. I'm going to press that. So now that is nice and flat. Now we're going to do this 7 more times. Now we have 8 blocks that we made from the 2 blocks that we sewed together. And they have the little dog ears that, if you're not familiar, that's what this little point is called that hangs off the end when you sew things on the diagonal. And they're not the exact size that we need them to be. So now we need to go from this to this. I already made another set of 8 and have them all trimmed. See how nice and perfectly shaped they are, no dog ears, and they're the size that we need to put the quilt block together. So to do this, I'm going to use a rotary mat. Different companies make them. They spin. Basically, it spins. You don't have to have one. You can always move your fabric, but sometimes it is easier and more precise when you move the mat and not the fabric and the ruler. We need to cut these to 2 1/4 inch square. So when I put that down, you'll notice that it's a little bit on each side, which is good because you want to make sure that these are very precise. So it's better to trim a little bit off all the sides than to have them not be the correct size. So let's talk about how to do that. You can, again, use any kind of a ruler. So use what you have. If you just have a rectangular ruler, you can make that work. But again, if you're going to do a lot of quilting, I would recommend investing in some squares. These are 2 different squares from Riley Blake. They're 2 1/2 inches. So we would just line them up. And this one, for these little cute cuts, these little flowers show you where that angle is. And then you can kind of see it. So you want to make sure that this seam is on that diagonal. You would move it up, trim it, turn it. But you'll notice it's rocking a little bit because of this seam. Same thing with this. This one is another cute cuts. This is called the Trim It, and it has the lines drawn just a little bit differently, seam allowance a little bit differently. So you would just line this line up right on that seam, move it where you need to move it. But again, it rocks. That's okay. I did that way for years, but I recently got these block locks, and oh my gosh, if you're going to do a lot of quilting, highly recommend you invest in these. It has a groove cut out that is 1/4 inch wide. This seam is going to sit right in that groove. Now watch this. It slides right up against that, no bouncing, because it has room in the acrylic, cut out in the acrylic for that. So it just kind of goes on there and it just hooks right onto there. So then this one, we're just going to slide a little bit because it is 2 1/2 inches. We're shooting for 2 1/4. So the only thing you have to think about is which way it goes. So if you try it this way, we're not going to make it big enough. Turn it around and have it lock in the opposite direction. So I usually cut 2 sides and then spin and then cut the other 2 sides, making sure that when I cut the first 2 sides, I have a little bit more than 2 1/4 left so that I can get a perfect square cut like this. So let's cut some half square triangles. You want to make sure you have a nice sharp blade in your rotary cutter when you're doing this, because when you're cutting through those dog ears, you're going through quite a few layers. So now I'm going to spin this and I'm just going to slide this down until we're at 2 1/4 inches here and here. Then I have found I get a better cut when I cut towards a dog ear instead of starting up there. So I'm going to start here and cut that direction, pull that off, and then cut that one. So that's just another little tip. So let us cut the other 7. All right, done. Now, if you're doing this on your own, you would be doing that process that we just did twice so that you end up with 16 of these half square triangles. Now we are going to set this up on a design board. So on the directions that you can get for free on my blog, there is a diagram. And so it shows you how to put each of these 4 corners together and then how to make the rows and put it all together. It is really important to follow these directions because you might think you know what you're doing and then you end up having too many sets this way instead of this way and it gets all confusing. So you can either put the whole block together on this design board, or you can do one bear paw at a time. And that's what we're going to do because it just feels less overwhelming. So we're going to look at this and we're going to put this together. So we have this square, and then you're going to rotate this so it's in the same direction as it is on this diagram. So these two are going that way, these are going this way, and then we have that corner. So that's one. If you want to set up a few boards, you can do that as well. It just makes it easy to put it down, pick it up, take it over to the sewing machine. So now what we're going to do is we're going to sew these 2 units. So I'm just going to flip these up and I'm going to put a clip on the side that gets sewn together. So then I'm going to go like this because these 2 get sewn together. So we'll sew these 2 units so they become like that. Then we'll sew this one to the top of this. We'll sew this to the top of this. And then we will sew them together and we will have one of the 4 bear paws. Then we just rinse and repeat until we get all 4. So I have my design board right next to my sewing machine. I'm going to take the squares that we clipped together. I'm going to make sure they are lined up really, really well. And I'm going to sew with a scant 1/4 inch down those 2 sides. So we have these 2 sewn. And we are going to set the seam just like we did when we were doing the half square triangle. And then we are going to fold them open. I'm going to put my design board back up here. I'm going to look at this picture again, and I'm going to set it up, making sure I'm paying attention to the direction of these half square triangles. It's really important to at each step come back, check your diagram, and put that together. So now we're going to put this one here, and then we're going to sew this unit to that bigger square. All right, now looking at our diagram again, we are almost done this block. We just have to sew this strip to this strip to get our first bear paw done. And we want to make sure that we are lining up that seam, it's hard to see because it's black and black, with that seam. So we want to line up that seam line as well as those edges and sew that together. If you ever find that when you're putting these together, that one is a bit longer than the other, which I was having, this one was a bit longer than this one, then you just need to take a ruler and measure your 1/4 inch seams and make sure you got them right. So this one I can just check with the blue. Others you're just going to check against the grid. So right here, this actually has 2 stitch lines on this block. The first one I did was too small. It wasn't a scant 1/4 inch. It was like, I don't know, less than that, whatever that was. And so then when I ironed that, this became too long. And if I didn't correct it, it was going to throw the whole block off. So I discovered that that was wrong. I took it back and I did a good 1/4 inch seam and repressed that. And now they are the same size. So we're matching this seam here, and now this bottom is matching as well, where before it was coming down to like here. So it is this kind of little detail you do not want to let slip. If things aren't lining up right, it's usually either you cut it wrong or you didn't quite get that seam correct. All right, let's see how this part came out. See how that's still kind of popping up. Just read that if you put a little bit of starch right in there, it is going to help flatten that. All right, we're going to try this. I've never done it before. I have spray starch, but you don't want to spray right on here because we don't want to starch the whole thing. We just want to be able to put a little bit right in that section that's kind of big. So I'm going to spray the starch into this little bowl, and then I'm going to use a Q-tip, or you could use a little paintbrush, and I'm just going to dab it to wet the fabric where it's kind of lumping. You can see it getting wet right there. And moment of truth, let's see if it helps. I think it did. I can't remember whose blog I was reading that I saw that on there, but thanks so much for the tip. Oh my gosh, that made quite a big difference. So I will be using that moving forward. Awesome. We now have one of the 4 bear paws done. Now we need to make 3 more, and then we can assemble the rest of the block. when you are pressing, have the solid pieces on top and press away. Instead of having this and having all of this fold back, you want your solid square on top and press like this. And I will show you why in 1 second. Okay, so that's pressed away, that's pressed away. So the top of our block. And now when we put these together, you'll see that this seam is going this way and this seam is pressed this way. So they're not overlapping, but they're what we call nesting. And it's going to give you a much flatter result when you have one going one way and one going the other way. And the best way to do that without having to think about it too much is if you have a solid square coming onto half square triangles, press the seam towards the solid square. So now we have all 4 of the Bear Paw blocks done. It's time to assemble it so that it's going to look like this. Now we're going to create our rows 1, 2, and 3. So you're going to take your blocks and you're going to position them in the same direction as they are on here. And you can just pivot them around so that they're the correct direction. This is our top row. This is our bottom row. Our chicken is going to go in the middle. And then we have these strips. All right, because I'm using fabric that's slightly directional, I just kind of looked at these pieces and I thought these are the 2 that look the most directional. So I put them here so that they would be lined up with that chicken. So now we're just going to pin these and sew these together. So I'm going to sew that, press, add that one, sew this one together, and then this one together. And then we will go 1, 2, 3. So we'll just start by getting these put together. And just like with the Bear Paw, we're going to have the solid rectangle of fabric on the top. We're going to, after we set that seam, we're going to push that forward so that the seams are under the solid part and we're not folding this back to make a bigger lump. We want to make sure we're nesting the seams. So this is the top one, and the seam is going this way. So for the middle row, if we do this, the seam is going the same direction, and it's going to be lumpier. So for this one, we want to press this way, away from the chicken, because that way, when we do this, that will be nested properly. So now I'm going to bring up the rest. So we're going to finish these rows. I'm going to clip to make sure I sew the correct edges together. We're in the home stretch now. Okay, because this is our solid rectangle, we have that on top. We press forward. And then remember, we pressed the chicken so that the chicken was going flat. So we're going to set that seam. We press that like that so that those seams are going to nest on either side of the chicken. So now we have row 1, 2, and 3. If all goes well, all of these seams are going to line up. Outsides are going to line up. We might have to trim a teeny bit. But next, we're just going to sew this one to this one. We'll press that, and then we'll sew this one to this one. So I always start by making sure my seams are nested well. And you can fold that back to make sure that that line right there is good. And also make sure the seam is lining up over here. Okay, we'll go sew rows 1 and 2 together. When you get to the bigger strips, this is where having the longer tailor's clapper comes in handy, because you can get pretty much that whole 12.5-inch strip at once, but you don't have to. You can just use this twice. Now this one is going to go here. So again, start with your seams. And also, I'm always looking down here just to make sure everything is staying lined up. These seams should all be lining up all the way across if everything went according to plan. Because the middle row has the fewest pieces and seams, you want to put that on the top and then flip that forward so that the seams are going towards that center section. Now we have the seams all lined up. Now, in a perfect world, this should square to 12.5 inches. It's not a perfect world. We got a little over here. We have some threads. Okay, when we flatten it down, it is pretty darn close. So I'm just going to take a long ruler and I'm just going to trim off a couple of these spots where it's just a little bit long. And that will also get some of those threads off. And when I'm doing this, I'm making sure so that these lines are parallel to the seam lines and the edge. We're really just getting a few little pieces that are poking out off. Now, I always take this time to check the back as well, especially when you have white fabric. If you have white, like a light and a dark, you want to make sure these dark threads aren't going to be here, or they could show through when you sew this block into a project. So there you go, we did it. So while this is made up of a lot of simple shapes, the half square triangles, squares, and some rectangles, you do need to be very careful and very precise with your seams. And if they're not quite right and things aren't lining up when you're doing like this section, pull that seam out and fix it. Otherwise, this would have been really, really off size. So the only thing left is to decide what you're going to make from this block. Let me know in the comments if you have tried this or what you plan on using with it. If you make any and post them on social media, be sure to tag me so I can see what fabrics you chose. Happy quilting!